in every situation. The cuts we made were administrative cuts, and they were redundancies. In some cases, we cut programs, but we only did that when we consolidated them into another program. So the task will continue. Their mission will continue. The people are still there for the most part.
Although I guess things get lost in the sauce. But I was looking for examples. The Novavax COVID vaccine, and that's not an mRNA vaccine, was expected to be approved by the FDA, but there's a delay. Why is there a delay? Is it just personnel being shuffled around? Why is that?
We're looking at that vaccine, and it is a single antigen vaccine. And for respiratory illnesses, the single antigen vaccines have never worked.
So it's not because of lack of personnel or lack of people?
I mean, we are actually shifting our priorities to multiple antigen vaccines, and NIH is already working on a number of those.
So that's the answer to that. I get that. Last week you said 20% of those fired were by mistake, and you knew that was going to happen. Do I have that right?
I didn't say that.
Okay, so tell me what you said or meant to say.
Yeah, that was a statement that Elon made at the beginning.
There was like an 80% and 20%. What do you mean to say, so for the record?
What Elon said to us at the beginning in our cabinet meeting, and I think it made a lot of mistakes, it made a lot of sense, is that when you do, our government, we're spending $2 trillion more than we have each year. And that's existential, and that's a public health issue. And we need to cut the size of the government and make it more efficient and make it do services more efficiently. HHS's job is to make America healthy, and we're spending $1.9 trillion a year, and people are not getting healthy. People are getting sicker and sicker.
So along those lines...
What Elon said is that when you do a disruption of this, a lot of times, 80% of the people that get cut, and, my heart goes out to anybody who loses their job. It's heartbreaking for all of us. But it's something that has to be done if we're going to save our country and restore it. And he said that anytime you do a disruption like this, 80% of the people need to go. You may make mistakes as much as 20, and then you go back and remedy that and mitigate it.
So that brings up a question. What specific metrics is DOGE using to decide if a program is waste, fraud, or abuse?
Well, they have a very, very sophisticated group of people. And they have a very sophisticated systems for detecting fraud, waste, and abuse.
And yet 20% of the people who were cut, it turns out it was a mistake.
That was a hypothetical.
But a lot of people were fired and then rehired, right? So I just wonder, I'm just trying to imagine, and I've also, run a company in the past, wouldn't it have been better, or was thought given to say before firing them, going through and saying, what is that job? What is that job? Line by line by line, and saying, I think that person's job maybe isn't needed. This has to be eliminated.
That would have been another approach, and it's the approach that has failed for 60 years.
Because you mean it takes too long?
It takes too long, and you lose political momentum. You need to do.
But there are some casualties, the 20%.
Yeah, and there are going to be casualties, and there's going to be mistakes. And what our job is, as we reconstitute this agency, make sure that those mistakes are rectified.
Good, and we're moving along nicely. So I want to go to the cuts to research and programs. You propose more than $11 billion in cuts to local and state programs addressing things like infectious disease, mental health, addiction, and childhood vaccination. Did you personally approve those cuts?
I'm not familiar with those cuts. We'd have to go.
There's like more than 50 pages of cuts that I actually went through.
The cuts were mainly DEI cuts, which the president.
There were a lot, but I'll give you. I actually my eyes are blurry from going through them, and I understand because my eyes were blurry why you might not have seen every one of them, but for example, about 750. You talk about diabetes, adolescent diabetes, so important. About $750,000 of a University of Michigan grant into adolescent diabetes was cut. Did you know that?
I didn't know that, and that's something that we'll look at.
Yeah. So that's I wonder, should these be considered DOGE cuts?
Well, I couldn't speak to that, Dr. Lapook, because I'm not familiar with that particular study, but there's a number of studies that were cut, that came to our attention and that did not deserve to be cut, and we reinstated them. Our purpose is not to reduce any level of scientific research that's important.
So that's. I'm so glad you said that, because figuring out what's important is tough, right? Because you may not know at the time you're doing basic research what will end up being super important later on. For example, a discovery made in 1970 ended up leading to the monoclonal antibody therapy against COVID that helped save the life of President Trump 50 years later. So, if at the time he rolled into the emergency room, somebody said, oh, I have an idea, let's have an antibody sop up the virus, it's way too late. You need decades of research. So how do you plan to ensure today's cuts won't mean decades in the future somebody will end up not getting the kind of care they could have had if the research was done?
By that virtue, you should just fund everything and hope for the best that, 50 years from now that the discovery.
Well, no, but at least you go line item by line item and say, diabetes research.
We're trying to target problems that we have in our society today that are very obvious, which is chronic disease. And we're trying to, and in infectious disease. And we're trying to target our cuts or are targeting our funding toward actually solving that problem. And we're reorienting, recalibrating our course. That we look at everything and say, is this designed to make, is this likely to make America healthy? And you have to do that. Anybody who's funding research makes those decisions.
And it's tough, right? Because you know as well as anybody, I would think, that you just may not know. If you go back to 1970, there's a plasma cell that we can fiddle around with to make it make one type of antibody. Why would anybody want to do that? Cut. And then it turns out 50 years later, it ends up helping to save the life of President Trump. So I think, what's it like for you in this position to be making those kind of, life and death decisions now?
Luckily, I have an extraordinarily talented group of people, probably the most talented people who have ever worked at NIH. Jay Bhattacharya, who was at Stanford, Marty McCary, who's running FDA, who came to us from Johns Hopkins. These are among the top researchers and doctors in the world.
So those are the people you're going to be talking with? Who are you talking with?
I talk with them every day.
With them every day?
I talk with them every day, and they share my aspirations and President Trump's aspirations that we want to do. We want to make sure that America remains the hub of scientific research in the world.